Okay, we're ready to go on.
Good evening. Welcome to our Let There Be Answers series. I'm John Hamer. I'm here with Leandro Palacios. We are streaming live from Toronto Centre Place as part of our Tuesday night weekly content, but this time as opposed to a formal lecture, we're opening it up to all of you, the listeners, to make comments and questions, and we can take those both about unanswered questions from recent lectures, but also just a wide variety of topics and interests that you maybe have been curious about. This is an open forum time, and so we very much enjoy these. One of the reasons we do it is because when we have things like the big conferences that Leandro and I have been engaged in the last 2 weeks for our denomination, we are not able to research and create all the slides for an entire new lecture, and so, but we don't want the community, the activity to lapse, and so we think it's fun to be able to shake it up. Hopefully you agree. And so why don't, while we wait, as Leandro gets everything online and going,
I want to make sure that I can just get the questions that come from you in the live chat as well. So we start with some of the questions that you have sent us in the YouTube comments after the lectures ended, after the live lectures ended, but as questions, and this time questions on any topic. No question is off topic. Well,
okay, well, we'll see.
I shouldn't say that, but more than usual, you are free to ask questions that have to do at least with what we talk about in our series of lectures on theology, history, and philosophy.
Absolutely.
And as I do that, John, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's upcoming?
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited. We have the calendar in the front of us, upcoming lectures. So next Tuesday, we are going to kind of do a deep dive into the history of the Jerusalem temple. And so this is often, thought of, we think of the original one as called Solomon's temple. And so how do we square the existence of a temple that's called Solomon's temple with what we've sort of have looked at in the past, that there's not a lot of good evidence that Solomon himself is a historical figure. And so was there a Solomon's temple? Yes, the answer is there was. But we maybe understand it, or the historical evidence for it, or what we can understand of it, is different from how it's told, because the biblical narrative is constructed centuries later based on the temple that they already have and how they then have understood their traditions or legends of how it came to be. And so we'll look at that, the earliest history that we can discern from it, from the accounts that we have in the Hebrew Bible. Then we will look at, of course, that temple was destroyed. We'll look at the various iterations of what's called the Second Temple. It's called the Second Temple not because there's only ever been 2 buildings. So the first temple isn't going to have been built just by one guy, and it exists exactly in its present, in the form that it was, like as the legendary King Solomon would have built it all the way up until it's destroyed by the Babylonians. Rather, there is a temple that is continuously used that would have been modified and added to and rebuilt and changed over the course of the first temple period. And that certainly happens in the Second Temple period as well, where the returning exiles, who are incredibly poor, they're living under Persian rule, they're only able to build quite a modest structure when they get going. And it is only once you get to the Hasmonean period, the Maccabee period, and especially the culmination with Herod the Great in the Roman period, where Herod, who is this incredible builder, he's the one who enlarges the temple platform, who builds the structure that we tend to think of when we think of the Jerusalem temple. And so we'll look at that whole history and ultimately the destruction of that structure by the Romans. And then what's the subsequent history of the temple site? Why didn't, when for example, when the Romans destroyed it and prevented any Jews from coming back to the city and made a pagan city there, created the pagan city of Aelia Capitolina, why, when the Roman Empire became Christian, why didn't Christians build a big cathedral on top of it? We'll look at why that would be. We'll look then why Muslims did build an incredible shrine on it, the first important Muslim structure, one of the most important religious structures in all of history, the Dome of the Rock. And then we'll look at then the subsequent ownership through the Crusades, the Ottoman period, and the present day. Next week after that, we are going to go back to theology, and we are going to talk about arguments that different theologians have made, especially the Christian theologians, but these are in some cases owing some of their ideas to previous Muslim theologians, and also there's also important Jewish theologians who have made the argument that that you can prove the existence of God, or that we can know God by reason alone, by a logical argument based on philosophy and first principles. And so many theologians have argued that, from Maimonides, Jewish theologian, Averroes, Avicenna. Those are the Latin versions of two Muslim theologians. Theologians like Aquinas, like Anselm of Bec, like Descartes, have all believed that you can make this argument. We'll look at their arguments. I'm generally speaking, I'll say I like them, but they're smart guys. I'm not sure I'm persuaded by them. We'll see. You can decide if you're persuaded by these arguments. I'm going to try to outline them. But then I want to also look at the consequences of these arguments. What are they saying God is, based on the arguments they're making? How do they understand God? What is the God of the theologians? And how absolutely different, night and day, is that from how, let's say, fundamentalists, Muslims, Jews, and Christians envision God in a very less abstract, less universal, more anthropomorphic, maybe, way. And so I think that will be a very interesting theological discussion. And so that's what we have lined up for the next 2 lectures. I hope you'll come to those and enjoy those. How are you doing in terms of questions?
Oh, good. I want to remind everyone you can help us reach out to more viewers by hitting like now, and by sharing this video, so that we put in motion the YouTube algorithms. And really, we don't put a paywall, we don't charge membership, because we believe that everyone should have access to a community that explores these topics. We believe that it's important for everyone to learn and think about these things. So if you also believe that, then you can help the channel in many ways. One way is with a simple like and a share, and another way is with your donations, either here in the YouTube chat or on our website, centerplace.ca/donate, where you have different options to give, especially in the US and Canada, where we can give you a tax receipt.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing in the live chat already a comment that is more, I think, a suggestion for new topics for lectures, but I like it, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Todd Radmaker says, is it time to do a deep dive into Christianity's most notorious heretic, Marcion? I think it is. That is a great idea we've done several lectures on early Christianities, the diversity of early Christianities. We've done one on Irenaeus, who is one of the major figures in the proto-Orthodox community that is fighting some of the alternate leaders like Marcion, or the Marcionite church, since Marcion will have been gone by the time Irenaeus is really active. But anyway, so I want to look at Marcion specifically as such an important early figure who actually has a major impact. So the fact that Marcion comes up with the idea of creating a canon is one of the reasons why the Proto-Orthodox, even though they don't agree with Marcion and Marcion's views, start creating their own canon. And so Irenaeus gets going and argues that we should consider there to be 4 Gospels that are canonical and not consider any of the other ones to be canonical. We consider those to be heretical, which set things on their path. So Todd, I think that's a great idea. So we definitely need to put that on the list of an upcoming lecture, who was Marcion, and so on. And then Todd also says, or look into agenda-driven, dishonest scholarship to eliminate the evidence of a historical Jesus. So you have an opinion on that in terms of that. We have had I think we had a lecture that's one of our most popular lectures where I talk about the evidence. I make the case for a historical Jesus. So, which is different. So there's a different question of arguing, and historians don't always do this, because since there is a almost universal consensus among historians that that the evidence is there. There is a historical Jesus. There are 1 or 2 guys who are outliers on this who have popular YouTube footprints, like Richard Carrier, obviously, is the main person. And so we don't normally have to prove a case that is established, and so you don't use the same argument. So rather, with the argument that is normally what most historians of the historical Jesus are doing is saying, given that there's a historical Jesus, which we've understood, what can we know of him? And so then, because we are starting with that foundation, we're now suggesting that, well, this or that thing may or may not be historical, or this saying may be more likely to go all the way back to the historical Jesus. And so then sometimes when people think that this question is really, really open, they say that this is a way too expansive argument about the historical Jesus, or if they think that we're now trying to have this be a proof of the historical Jesus. It's not. We can go through and make the case for why historians believe that we have sufficient evidence to say that there was a historical Jesus, mm-hmm. and we've made that case before. I don't know. It could potentially make it. I don't intend to go into the counter cases and go through the people who think that like the Carrier or the Caesar myth people or those kind mm-hmm. of things. But since we usually try to do ones that are more positive than negative.
But I wouldn't say that there's a lot of deliberate, dishonest scholarship to try to just negate the historical Jesus. Actually, John, there's one of the questions that came on Discord.
Oh, okay.
Has to do with something that we talked about. This is a question from Jeff Koons, came in on our Discord server about the Testimonium Flavianum, which we had mentioned in several recent lectures, and this is something that it actually speaks to this question.
Oh, okay.
Because it has to do with scholarship and the reality that scholarship is not free of bias. So
sure.
There's maximalists and minimalist scholars, whether you're doing archaeology, Bible, research, history, and some of us come with a more maximalist view. That is, like we lean toward more historicity of the Bible, whereas some other scholars, right. theologians, just see it in other ways. We right. try to just be very skeptical about any evidence that might suggest historicity of not just Jesus, but anything that the Bible speaks about. So
right.
Can you
so I'm more of a minimalist, and some of other people are more maximalist.
And I think in general, I'm a minimalist. Not that I have an agenda to disprove any historicity, but I think I come as a theologian. I am interested in history, but I'm also more interested in the meaning of the text. And usually when we're just so focused on the historicity, we forget what the text really means.
Well, and I think that some of the people who are maximalists, who are also religious, have a theological need, because they need something to have happened in history.
So you're
and so
saying
they're
that
wanting to prove that. Whereas I'm saying that you and I, our own tradition is not based on historicity. So in other words, it doesn't matter if the historical Jesus existed or not for our understanding of Christianity. Or mine.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak for you. But anyway, so for mine. In other words, it's not based on historicity, it's not based on literalism. That's not what it's about.
And that's
so
where
therefore
I
go
stand
into
as a theologian.
Yeah. So, okay, let's go ahead and into those questions. So there are two actually parallel questions, because Magi Mike also asked about this. So Magi Mike said, curious if John had the chance to read a book by J.C. Schmidt, Josephus and Joseph, that it's about what scholars call the Testimonium Flavianum, and Magi Mike said he would love to get a take. And Jeff Kuntz on the Discord said, following up on this Testimonium Flavianum question, there's this book, he sent out links about that. So in other words, both of you were interested in that. So I did look at the book. I haven't got the whole book and read it, but I have gone through summaries of what, and I want to get the book actually, summaries of what J.C. Schmidt has said. And so we've talked about this before. So we had a whole lecture on Josephus and this question, the Testimonium Flavianum. This is the number one or main place where a non-Christian historian of the first century is talking about the historical Jesus and the impact of the historical Jesus. And the problem with it is that it at the minimum, it seems to be contaminated. And we've talked about it in this thing, so I don't have the quote of how it is, but essentially there's one little paragraph that Josephus, who is a Jewish Roman historian, writing multiple texts, but about the First Roman Jewish War, and also attempting to write about especially Hellenized Judaism for a Roman audience, so that Romans will accept Hellenized Judaism as consonant with Romanitas, being Roman. And so he is agenda-driven. He is not necessarily seen as that's his agenda. In other words, he's not necessarily seen by a lot. I mean, so I think there's a love-hate relationship with him that people who are Jews today, Rabbinic Judaism has with Josephus, perhaps. He certainly, in any event, that was certainly true in the Middle Ages. So all of the texts of Josephus are preserved by Christians, by Christian monks in Christian libraries through the Middle Ages. And so at some point or other, this paragraph seems to have been contaminated by Christian scribes who have made it better. And that's the general historical consensus. And so in our lecture, I suggested that the way this works is when you have a manuscript, everything is a manuscript, you have a text, then someone writes in a gloss. So everything is just written by hand anyway, and then a scribe writes a gloss, that is to say, an addition. And then when you make a new copy, sometimes what happens, people will just copy the original text, but sometimes the scribe will copy the text and the gloss, and they'll put it all together as if that had been the text originally. And that's one of the ways that we have these textual expansions. And so what seems to have happened, or what the majority of scholarly consensus has been, is that there are some interpolations, there are some additional Christian glosses that have been brought into the text that are not original to Josephus, but that Josephus does in fact talk about the historical Jesus. And part of the reason that it seems likely that he did is because he also has a different passages where he talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and where he talks about John the Baptist. And those are just generally accepted that Josephus wrote those. And so anyway, this new scholarship written by J.C. Schmidt, he actually, I would say, when we were talking about maximalist and minimalist, he's a little bit more maximalist. He would like to actually take this further and try to rescue more of the this passage. So rather than thinking whole sentences here have been added by Christian scribes, he's arguing that just a couple little words have been taken out. And so it says things like, he was the Christ. And so I will have argued in the past that that's Christian interpolation that some Christian scribe has added. What J.C. Smith is saying is that just a word here has been deleted. He was said to be the Christ. In other words, that the original text of Josephus was more ambiguous, and some Christian scribe has deleted a couple words. And in that way, Schmidt is trying to rehabilitate and claim more of the text to be original to Josephus than it is. I haven't read the whole book, so I'm not sure if, on the surface, I'm not persuaded by that. But he does have a lot of other interesting things, including he is making a case that it says that the first men among us, that is to say, leaders that of the Jewish people, are the people who essentially went and acted against Jesus, which we believe is true from the Christian accounts as well. But what Schmidt is arguing here is when Josephus says that in the rest of other parts of his text, that is when he's talking about people who he personally knew. So in other words, that he has like a direct contact with some Sadducee priest that will have known or have been alive at the time of the trial or something like that. And that's an interesting idea if that's the case. So I do want to get a copy of this book. I'm interested in it.
I definitely want to read the book. But in general, I remain skeptic of any new scholarship and that just totally contradicts like the mainstream position. So I guess that makes me a conservative in that sense. But I still have to read it. But I do, especially I love Josephus. I find Josephus' writings fascinating and entertaining. And something that we have to also remember about Josephus is that he is writing within a context where not everything that authors are writing are history.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So Josephus is making claims that are not historical. Josephus is making claims to impress his patron. Josephus is talking about magic incantations that work in such and such way, and he offers in other works, right? And he offers proof that if you say this particular incantation using this particular plant or in the name of Solomon, then the people have actually been cured of all sorts of diseases, and the exorcisms have happened in these ways. So that's the kind of author that we are talking about. We're not talking about someone who writes modern history.
No, he's not. Yeah, so he's not participating. Obviously, he's an ancient person. He's not participating in the modern academic discipline of history. He's an ancient historian. He's doing the same exact thing for Jewish myth that Greek historians are doing for Greek myth, and that is he's trying to recover as much, for example, of the biblical accounts, and he assumes they're based on a kernel of history, or that they're semi-historical, that Moses was an actual historical figure who was the author of these books. He just makes those assumptions, which modern scholarship fully rejects that kind of idea. And he essentially will take supernatural elements out, but try to preserve kind of a historical account. The same way that Herodotus, will clean up Greek myths in order to try to make those, as if they were history. So.
I want to thank, before we continue, I want to thank Phil, Fire Ever Living, and Dave Anderson for supporting the channel and the chat. And let's go to our next question that came in the chat, John. Pamela 1 says...
Oh, okay, I'm sorry,
why do people keep obsessing about the second coming? The Bible clearly states that we're not to wonder about when. Besides, trying to follow Jesus' teaching is an everyday lifetime endeavor. And this reminds me also of other questions that came in, like, are we due for the rapture today?
It's today, right? Oh,
I think
right.
it's-
We better watch out.
I mean, yeah, someone just,
So if
Mike was
if,
telling me there's like
if
big
Leandro and I
storms coming.
disappear, I don't know,
No, like that happened a couple of weeks ago, but that was the internet. That was the
was the
modem,
internet, that's right.
not the rapture.
Okay.
Although it's almost the same for me.
Yeah, Pamela. I think it's pretty clear that the texts that even the Apocalypticists are making within the authors that are saying no person knows the time in which it'll come. That doesn't stop. Hasn't stopped a whole breed of a type of Christians, apocalypticists in the present, from doing the math of trying to come up with times. People getting really excited about it. Obviously, there was a preacher in South Africa who had some kind of revelation, I guess, that it's going to happen today. We'll just mention the rapture is not biblical. There is no ancient idea or medieval, there's no idea of the rapture. That is not the intent of any of the writers. This is a 19th century reading of isolated verses of the Bible that are read together because they're misunderstanding what the Bible is. The Bible is not simply one book. It is a bunch of distinct books. And so you can't just pull a couple verses out and kind of glom them all together and try to imagine a thing. So this idea is not something that anybody had in antiquity or in the Middle Ages. It's a modern fundamentalist evangelical idea. So you don't have to worry about the rapture. There's not a rapture. Anyway, and I agree with you, Pamela. This is not. We shouldn't be thinking about it. I mean, in terms of as a worry or concern is, it should be living our lives here meaningfully, doing Christian. Being Christian in good ways, which is by being inclusive of others, of helping others who are the last and least, giving that kind of a focus rather than, I think there's a hymn a children's hymn that we used to sing. It was like, wake up and do something more than dream of your mansions above. Don't be constantly, doing good as a pleasure, a joy beyond measure. This was a song that I had as a kid. But anyway, in other words, there's no reason to be sitting around dreaming of heaven and thinking about that. You need to be focused on, this life and how are we living this life meaningfully? How are we, being aligning ourselves with God, which is to say with goodness, with love.
But I guess it's a very easy and satisfying theology when you are told that what you do matters, and so you work toward that, because there's going to be this moment where you're going to have to pay the tab, and some are going to be rewarded and some are going to be punished. But now, if we remove that, what's left? And I think for a lot of people that kind of I'm a good person because I'm going to get rewarded is a very satisfying and understandable and tangible way of living.
Yeah. So again, though, that's heresy for Christianity. And so the idea of it is that if you are only acting, but if you're only acting so that you'll be rewarded, or you're only acting so that you'll avoid punishment, that's what a mercenary does. Mm-hmm. So that means your motivation is tainted. That is not behaving in a Christ-like way. That's not behaving selflessly on behalf of motivated out of love for others. That's motivated because you want to get rewarded or you don't want to be punished. And so that's not how it works, according to Christianity anyway. According to the Christian theology, mm-hmm. Obviously it's how lots of
fundamentalists.
Yeah, it's how fundamentalism works in all kinds of religions. Prosperity gospel kind of thing. So, but yeah, so what do you do instead? Instead of worrying about doing this thing for some kind of payday, it's a reward in of itself as you are aligning if we understand God as love, as you are more and more motivated to align yourself with love so that you're acting out of love, there is a reward there. This is a reward that is understood beyond the walls of Christianity. So one of the great Christian theologians of the end of antiquity, Boethius, who wrote The Consolation of Philosophy while he was he had been the prime minister of the Ostrogothic kingdom, essentially, and we had a whole lecture on him, and he was awaiting execution, and so he goes through the whole thing about how should we be motivated, and he says if you're just going to be motivated because you want to be rich, you're always, no matter how rich you get, like Elon Musk, you want more. If you're going to be motivated because of you want fame, no matter how much fame you have, you're going to want more. And so in other words, all of these kinds of, those kind of things are fleeting and insatiable. Whereas he's saying is if you are motivated by qualities like love, then you can come in, you or yourself are aligning with the eternal. And so therefore that your ego isn't the focus of it. So that's what I would say. So we don't have to, it's not for a payday. It's here and now as you are aligning towards that.
Okay, why don't we go through some of the questions that came in the chat.
Okay.
Hopefully in order. We have Jake D, who says, besides the Bible, what is your top book recommendation about theology or biblical history for a general audience? Those are like probably two different books. It's like one about theology and one about biblical history. I can talk about one like theology book, like a comprehensive introduction to theology that we had to read in my seminary experience, which is called it's from Daniel Migliore, who is a Calvinist, Presbyterian theologian. In Faith Seeks Understanding, which is a famous phrase of St. Anselm, is the title of the book, Faith Seeking Understanding. Now, I would say I really, really struggled with that book because I generally did not agree in how in Migliore's particular stances on certain interpretations. However, I think he is a good teacher and he does a good job at laying out what the different what you should know about theology. He structures. He's got a very good teaching methodology for introducing readers to theology, going from the beginning, like the introducing the history of theology, how it developed, and in also explaining how modern theology is divided into the many different liberation theologies and postmodern theologies and so on. And something that I like is that to one extent he offers pros and cons of different positions in theology, even his own position. So that is actually commendable. He also adds, I think the book has been, we have the 4th edition that came out just 2 years ago. So it's very up to date. So he keeps adding new chapters to this book, to this work that he started like more than a decade ago. So how about history?
Well, I was going to give a theology one too.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So a series that I absolutely recommend is a history of philosophy without any gaps. And so this is a big, long series, and I love it. And so even though it's about philosophy, because it's without any gaps, it includes all the theology too, because normally what happens is that people do a little bit of ancient Greek philosophy and then fast forward to the Enlightenment or something like that,
right.
you know. And so what this series does is, it has the pre-Socratics and the classical Greek Western philosophy, but then it goes through the whole thing. So it has also Hellenistic, Greco-Roman, late Greco-Roman practical philosophy and theology. Then it goes into the Middle Ages, and we have all of the whole Christian, but also Muslim period, and so on. And so as a result, it really dives deep into it's without any gaps, so every one of the thinkers throughout all of time. And we find out actually that the immediate context of the one is important to the next. And so reading it all without any gaps is really great. And then the author of this, and I'm forgetting his name, is really accessible. So you'd think this may be, it's like this series this long, right? You'd think it would be boring, but it's actually very, very easy to get caught up in. So.
And another way to approach both like theology and the history is to get like a collection of excerpts from theologians, and having someone to introduce you to selections of the works of theologians from all the way back to antiquity to modern to the 21st century. There's multiple collections. One that I do like and that we will see in an upcoming series is on a series that we're starting a couple of weeks from now on mysticism, on Christian mysticism. We will explore what is sometimes considered the Christian mystics, and many of them, or if not most of them, are women. There's a wonderful collection of women's theologians, the writings of women's theologians by Amy Oden. In Her Words is the book called. In Her Words by Amy Oden has the highlights all the women voices of Christian theology from antiquity, from all the way back to I think Thecla, Perpetua, to 21st century women voices in theology, and although we sometimes just consider this branch of theology, the women's theology, as mystics, it's actually theology.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, and in terms of like biblical, like just dipping your toes into like a summaries of biblical scholarship, one of the most approachable writers on this is Bart Ehrman. So he has a whole bunch of books that are often overlap in a lot of the things like misquoting Jesus, that kind of thing, are that. And if you want to, let's say, jump into biblical studies, a brief book. John Kloppenborg here in Toronto wrote "Q, the Earliest Gospel," and that tackles straight on the synoptic problem. And it's his brief book for that, as opposed to he's got a much longer book, which is really good too, but that's a big slog. So I don't know.
And really, since you mentioned, aside from the Bible, one good introductory way would be to get a study Bible, like a good annotated Bible that will have pretty much half and half scripture and footnotes explaining what it really succinctly what the scripture is talking about. So the Oxford annotated Bible is one that I use.
Yeah, me too.
There's another question in the chat from Rai the King. Any plans to move the lectures to a separate channel might help with the algorithm promoting them?
So we are planning on moving some content to a separate channel. So we're planning on moving. So right now we have so one of the things, it's all on the same channel. But we are planning on moving, for example, our hymns. So like, for example, from the Beyond the Walls choir, we're planning on moving most of those to a new resource, so that those are easier to find, so those will be cordoned into a zone. We're also planning on moving other kinds of resources that come from the church stuff. So like if I'm giving a sermon or something, we'll put that onto a different channel. We're
the meditations as well into a separate channel.
The meditations, those will go onto a separate channel. We're not planning on separating out our Sunday service from this channel at present. That's not the current plan, but we're still exploring. So things are. The channel has grown, and we also are aware that some of what we're doing, doesn't help the algorithm, and like you say, you get notifications that are wrong. I mean, I wouldn't for what your interests are. we've tried to trying to do things like where we tag things, but it doesn't really work. We try to work with the algorithm that way. So.
David Latorre, why did the Community of Christ Church adopt the spiral?
So the spiral, there is some old history with it that goes all the way back into the 20th century, but the earlier 20th century. But I think that the real time when it really gets adopted as a symbol of the church is when the church created its temple headquarters which is dedicated to peace, and it's in Independence, Missouri. That is to say, Kansas City area. And so, if you haven't seen it, you can Google it. It's a really amazing building that is built as a spiral. And so that is when that became kind of a symbol of the church, where that is itself the symbol. And you can see the spiral on the wall behind us as echoing that. So my understanding of it is that we think of this as the path that we take through life, the intentional path, the path of the disciple. So as we are moving through life, we can't say that life is always, going in one straight direction. Rather, we have our ups and downs. We are hopefully ascending as we're learning more, but it is a path as we're moving upward and inward and then outward again to take what we learn as we commune with the divine out into the world. And so that has been, also the spiral is an incredible universal symbol that a lot of religions haven't claimed.
Right.
So we might as well grab it.
And it's very ancient as
It is.
well.
Yeah, some of the earliest temples on Malta, for example, use those. And so I think it's quite beautiful. I like it. I especially have emphasized it, I think, more than, it's certainly the symbol of the temple, but I don't think it gets emphasized as much elsewhere in the church, other than what we do.
And the follow-up question is your congregation's progressive theology characteristic of this church, Community of Christ?
So I would say the answer to that is yes. So I find that when we hear at least from leadership, right? So when we go to headquarters, when we hear most leaders, when they speak and preach, they are often actually maybe more progressive sometimes in what they're willing to say, because we're, where maybe,
I guess depending on what you mean by progressive.
Well, it depends on what you mean, but I guess I'm saying that this is when we do that, we go into the United States, and I guess I mean on that spectrum that as understood in the United States, which is not how we maybe everybody's thinking. So I would say that one thing that we may have here that is a special distinction that not everybody is fully on board with or is up to date with, it's an agreement with the principles, but they don't make the emphasis. In other words, we maybe have a little bit different emphasis. And so this emphasis that I make as a historian, where I'm very clear that we're not focused on historicity and we're not focused on literalism. I probably echo that a lot more than you'll hear from other leaders, but it doesn't mean that because we're out of alignment or more progressive. I actually think that it's just a matter of emphasis. Other people might be much emphasizing other things that you would call very progressive.
But also I think with this church and with any other church and any other religion, what matters is context. So you might be a Community of Christ congregation in a large metro area, and you're going to be progressive. But if you go to a congregation in a rural area, maybe they're not going to be so welcoming of trans people. Some congregations may not so much like the idea of having a woman in priesthood. But guess what? That's also going to be the stance of other churches in the area.
Well, but I wouldn't stereotype it though. I mean, there's diversity, and
there is diversity,
and
yes.
so one of our more, socially conservative congregations of this church was actually in Long Beach, California, until they shut down. So and we have, some of the most rural congregations have really progressive leaders on those kind of social issues here in Canada. I know. So
yeah, and usually
we paint with broad pictures sometimes, but for example, I was talking to the pastor of the Nairobi congregation, and a lot of times you think, well, people in Africa are way more they're actually experiencing a lot of the kinds of things in Nairobi than we are here, because the global culture is everywhere, and they are, they're themselves more middle class and that kind of a thing. And so I don't know. So I wouldn't just say I would say there is a lot of diversity, but I would say that we are not outliers.
Yeah, there isn't a sharp divide, but in general, you might find that some congregations are more progressive than others, but yet it is also true that in a lot of rural areas, the community of Christ, in the U.S. especially, the community of Christ congregation is often the way that it attracts people is by being the only inclusive, progressive church in the area. So that is true in a lot of places in the United States, and in Canada, you see in places like Chilliwack, where there's a lot of evangelical churches in the area. In Chilliwack, in British Columbia, the Community of Christ congregation is as progressive, more or less, as we are here.
Yeah. Okay.
A cat named Dorak. Several times we are told to be just babes to Christ and not ready to receive the true gospel. Are we ready yet, or are we still told a false gospel?
Well, so I'm not saying I wouldn't suggest that interpretation of that is that there's a false gospel and a true gospel. I think that what we can understand is that there's always going to be more depth and more sophistication when you are thinking about theological ideas, when you're thinking about philosophical ideas. So in some cases, you have something that is simple principles where, if you were told, if you're living your life in some ways according to easy to remember proverbs, you will have some good outcomes. However, if you start to believe them, in this very literalistic way, and you believe, okay, if I do all of these things according to proverbs or according to a list of commandments, then I will always be rewarded and have good results, then you will become very dissatisfied and upset when you don't get good results. In other words, the scriptures also tell us that God reigns on the just and unjust. The sun rises, on the wicked and the righteous. In other words, that's not how the universe works. And so a deeper understanding of this is also always possible. And so our ministry here, our church here, is never about trying to debunk people's views that they are having, but rather to give them additional insights, especially when the, let's say, more straightforward or black and white understanding that they have could get them into trouble, or has sometimes gotten them into trouble. And that's why I would say there's not a false gospel. It is rather, there is always capacity to understand things in a deeper, more sophisticated way, and that always gets you, then that's just getting you closer and closer, while you'll never get to being divine, because we are ourselves finite and limited, and we are only going to get to as much as we have the capacity to do. We all have our own limitations. We have our blind spots. People 100 years from now will look back on things that I'm saying, and they'll say, what was he talking about with that? So we know so much more. Hopefully, because hopefully there will always be, continually learning and growing. So.
All right. So we have another question that came in online, and it's about the lecture on Origen. Marcion and Valentinus both on your lecture on Origen is great. I would also like to see one on Gregory of Nyssa. Have we done one on Gregory?
No, we've done one on Origen. So we were just talking about how we should add Marcion to the calendar, and Kinetic here is saying that let's add Valentinus as well, and that's a great idea, and Gregory of Nyssa. So I would like...
I thought you were going to say we should add Marcion to the canon.
No, we should add that to the calendar of lectures. And Valentinus, you can also say immediately that one stands out as somebody who we should definitely be tackling. So I agree. Thank you. Thanks for these additional suggestions for lectures.
Leon Berg, are you familiar, says Leon, with a new book, Christ Before Jesus, Evidence for the Second Century Origins of Jesus, a book by Jaron Wingo and Matthew Britt, who are data scientists in scare quotes for some reason, Leon, but I haven't read the book. Have you read the book?
No.
What I know about the book is that it's another one of those interesting books that is using modern techniques to analyze ancient text, like the stylometry.
Right.
In the book that we were just discussing,
we were just mentioning
it's the same
before,
way, except that in this book they
this
take
is using it the opposite way.
The opposite way.
So we were just talking about this about the author who was part of his case that he's making about Josephus is through stylometry, that is to say, a computer-aided analysis of word use and that kind of thing. And I guess apparently that's why Leon is talking about these two guys who are data scientists who are making making this kind of analysis. So I have to tell you, I'm not very easily persuaded by stylometry scientists, because I've been very familiar with this since the 1980s, because there's just been like 50% of all of these studies have been about the Book of Mormon. And that's dating back to the 1980s, because people started doing that, where they are both apologetically making the case that they've run the Book of Mormon through a computer and it proves that it's ancient and so on, and then everybody runs it through another computer and it proves that Solomon Spaulding wrote it, and then another people run it through a computer. It proves whatever they want. So in other words, the way that you think that computer tells you so makes it it has some legitimacy. I appreciate that the technique has improved, but I'm less convinced by it. If these guys' computer has told them that Jesus is a second century creation, then it shows their computer is wrong. So in other words, it shows their data is wrong, because I can just say that. So, okay.
Ryder King also asked if we have any plans for collaborations. We would love to.
Yeah,
not with just these two scholars that you mentioned, but with other channels. But of course, it's like we would love to. We don't have any plans, any concrete plans at the moment.
No. Yeah. But it doesn't mean we wouldn't.
Doesn't mean we don't want to.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question from Jake D. I don't know if you would like to talk about that. John says, could John and Leandro share a little bit about how they came to be religious? Like, were they born into a religious family or through school? And so I guess a little bit about our background.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure. So I grew up as a Mormon kid, so in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I was definitely very committed to it, and so was my whole family. I was oldest of 5 kids. I would describe us, the model of our family, as being like the Von Trapps in The Sound of Music. We had our own traveling puppet show. In other words, we were doing all of those kinds of kind of activities. Very intentional and creative. My mom would have those kind of activities for us, and so I was also very interested in history and in ancient texts, and so I would read the Bible, and I would read the Book of Mormon when I was a teenager, and other Mormon scripture like the Book of Abraham. And as a teenager, I started comparing those and looking at just the complexity of a book like Genesis and all of the weirdness that exists in Genesis and Exodus that call it out as a very ancient text because it's incomprehensible. You would never write it that way because it's embarrassing to modern Christianity, maybe, and all kinds of other things. Whereas the Book of Mormon is written in one sort of very flowing narrative, one voice, despite what some people's computers tell them about there being multiple authors. It's very, it lacks those incomprehensible aspects to it. It is written definitely within the same context of its actual authorship of 19th century, 1830. It's very well set. And very clearly also the Book of Abraham, which includes diagrams, actually drawings from hieroglyphic texts that Joseph Smith, who is the author of the Book of Abraham, misidentifies. So he claims to have the gift and power of God translated ancient Egyptian texts, which he very clearly, what I can tell as a 16-year-old, there was no internet that could teach me all these things. So this was just me reading the scriptures myself. You could tell that they have a person who is being mummified. You have the canopic jars under the regular bed, and Joseph Smith misidentifies that as Abraham on an altar being about to be sacrificed and so forth. So it's very clear to me that that this wasn't, that both the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham were not ancient texts, and so that made it so that I wasn't, that deconstructed that for me. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll stay within this because it's a good social organization and so on. But actually, by the time I got to be about 18, I realized how a church that doesn't understand or doesn't allow women in leadership. So every single thing in the Mormon Church is a priesthood function. All men are in priesthood, women are not in priesthood. And so on the issue of sexism, when I became 18, I left the Mormon Church, wasn't interested in it, and went off into graduate school where I studied in the Middle Ages. I studied medieval history, so I studied a lot of religions, very interested in the history of Christianity, but I wasn't personally religious. And so I only came back to the religion and came back to religion personally in my 30s when I encountered Community of Christ for the first time. So Community of Christ has its origins in common with the Mormon Church, and I started encountering Community of Christ when I would go to church history sites, and I then encountered historians from the church, and they started telling me, this church is very different from what you think all churches are like. And I just assumed all churches were fundamentalistic and like the Mormon Church and committed to, the Mormon Church has been very committed to, historically it's been very racist. It's tried to get past that, but without apologizing for its past, just wiping it, pretending it is. Continues to be very being sexist, and also it has been very aggressively anti-LGBT. So in other words, I kind of painted churches in that way, and instead I found a church where people, don't hold to those sorts of negative social conventions, and also have a very different way of looking at Scripture. So in other words, that it was not focused on historicity and not focused on literalism, and have a very different non-anthropomorphic, a very more sophisticated way of understanding the divine. And so that actually led me to say, well, I really enjoy these people, and I really I am feeling a call to be part of this community, but I can't do that unless I actually can consider myself to be Christian. And I had never, as a Mormon, I had never actually read any of the gospel books all the way through. And so that kind of began my path as I worked through the Gospels. I was initially very upset. I read the Gospel of John first, and it drove me crazy because it was so clearly non-historical. So in other words, this is not written as an account of anybody. If anybody, the pretext that I had always been told traditionally that the Apostle John wrote this as an eyewitness, that's clearly false. You can read it from just a page in, you can tell this is written later, and it's written by people who are already believing in a theological understanding of Jesus. But it's only then that I started reading all of the studies of the historical Jesus, and I started reading more sophisticated theology and so forth. And that allowed me to understand that actually where I am is very well positioned within a tradition that goes all the way back to the beginning, which is a theological tradition. Most people in the pews haven't been there, but now that we have a population that is widely, has gone to college and graduate school and so forth, more people can be doing the kinds of interaction with the religion that someone like Anselm or Aquinas was doing. And so that's my path.
That's your path. Do you know, did you encounter in your experience a pledge of allegiance? Do you know what that is?
No.
Hislang is asking about the
So
pledge of allegiance.
So Hislang found this printed in like a RLDS book from the 1950s or something like that, and so I've never seen it other than the document you showed us, Hislang. So.
In my case, I grew up in the Catholic Church in Argentina. My family were like agnostic. My mother, culturally Catholic. She wanted us to go to Catholic school and just be good Catholic boys, which means just take communion and confirmation and all the other sacraments. We didn't have a lot of books at home, but we did have a Bible. And so I would just read the Bible from beginning to end, and I would start over again. And at some point, I also started focusing more on the Old Testament, because I grew up also with my cousins who are Jewish, and their Bible was like our Bible, but our Bible had this additional part of the Bible that, by the way, Shana Tova to you and to all our Jewish friends. Now, at some point, I think at the time I took my confirmation at the age of 12, I knew that I didn't want to know anything about this church. I thought Mass was the most boring thing on earth. I eventually ended up in Soka Gakkai, which is a Buddhist organization. So very different from my Catholic experience. This is a small, very centralized religious organization, but it's Buddhism. Eventually I moved on because there were lots of things that I didn't like about this religion, especially the focus on leadership and the idea that there's only enlightenment and spiritual fulfillment if you follow what this particular religion says and not what other religions have to offer. So the Soka Gakkai, at least at the time, claimed exclusivity of the path toward ultimate fulfillment, enlightenment, nirvana, whatever you want to call it. That's when I found Community of Christ. This was a church that I had never heard of, and I found a great honesty because they were saying, yes, no, we are a church, but we're not the only church. And something that John also mentioned about the honesty about what the Bible really is and how we can use the Bible today, which I had never heard before. This was the first time that I heard a priest, someone in a Christian ordained minister telling me, oh yeah, no, these things that the Bible says here and the giants and the creation story and all that, that's not history. That's not what Christianity is about. So that made a big impression on me at the time. I had never heard that before from a minister. At the time I was also exploring Zen Buddhism, which I still practice. And through Zen Buddhism and my experience with this other Nichiren Buddhism, I was able to return to Christianity with a different understanding. I was able to look at the parables of Jesus in the way that I look at Zen koans, Zen aphorisms. So it was a totally different way of understanding this tradition that I had grown up into, and that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, and I love what you bring to that. When we've talked about like some of the Jesus parables, especially in their kind of concise form in the Gospel of Thomas, those really seem like the Zen koans, when you make the analogy of that.
What else do we have in the chat? Ricky Palacios, which letters of Paul are authentic? And besides the pastoral epistles, what are the other letters of Paul's that are pseudo-epigraphical?
So yeah, the pastoral epistles, which are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, those are the ones that everybody but very maximalist scholars who are trying to reclaim as much as possible for Paul would agree. Most most scholars are all agreed that those are not written by Paul, but are written in Paul's name. The ones that scholarship is a little divided on are 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And so those are the ones that contain things that may seem like anachronisms, where the author is perhaps writing something about a more development of the Christian church that occurs later in the first century, and so therefore may not have been by Paul. There is also some possibilities, like, for example, within, let's say, 2 Corinthians, which may be an amalgamation of a bunch of letters, that maybe a non-Pauline letter got in there, because at a certain point he's writing and then he says something that's almost the opposite of what Paul usually says, and maybe a letter that they had gotten, the Corinthians had gotten from one of Paul's opponents, which he is fighting with, and maybe accidentally made it in. Or at least that's an argument that some people have made. But in general, yeah. So in general, the ones that are believed to be authentic are Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and the little Philemon letter.
There's another question about Paul.
Okay.
So Mary Magnuson says, I've often wondered why the Gospels do not mention Paul. Surely the Gospel writers were aware of Paul and meeting with the apostles.
Right, but the other, so in some ways, Mary, one of the Gospels does mention Paul, and that is the book of Luke Acts, which is, we divide that book into two parts and separate it, but it's agreed even traditionally that is written by the same author, and it's the two parts of essentially the same text. And what Luke ends and continues the narrative with the beginning of Acts, and the first half of Acts is about some of the apostles and focusing on Peter, and then it switches entirely over to Paul. And so the author of the Gospel of Luke is doing that, and the only reason why Paul doesn't appear is Paul has no part of the story. So Paul is only enters into the story after Jesus' execution. And so he is not one of the historical disciples in terms of, he is a historical disciple, but not of the historical Jesus. He is a very early disciple of the risen Christ, as he has an experience, a faith experience with the risen Christ. It's described in Acts, but the way it's described in Acts, this road to Damascus moment, is different than how Paul describes it himself. And so it's sometimes imagined that Luke is a companion, of Paul, but in fact, there is a companion of Paul named Luke, but there's no reason to believe that the author of Luke Acts is a companion of Paul, because they differ from Paul's theology a lot. Paul is 100%. One of his major claims is that he's an apostle. They don't. Luke Acts is not really giving him that kind of title, and so, in other words, Paul's important, and the author of Luke and Acts admires Paul, but is not fully on board with everything Paul has to say in Paul's own writings. And so in terms of the other authors, Paul just doesn't enter into that part of the story. So they don't take it up past. Much past the resurrection. I mean, in fact, there's hardly anything in Mark. I mean, it just goes up to the empty tomb.
Now,
in the original ending. My
question to you is to follow up these two questions from Ricky and Mary.
Yeah.
Then what do we do about it? Does that mean that these texts are less valid? For example, if a letter of Paul was not really written by Paul, does that mean that it's not as important?
No.
As if it had been written by Paul? And if Paul is not mentioned in the Gospels, does that mean that Paul was less important in Christianity than we give him credit for?
Well, so what I would say is that that I think Paul is very important, but at different times, and so I would say that he's very important in getting the whole thing all spread. In terms of so initially there's just a movement that is largely confined within Second Temple Judaism, And then Paul, who's a very early convert, immediately starts to see that he's getting results in the non-Jewish community. Specifically, there are lots of people who are essentially, they grew up as Greco-Roman pagans, but they go to Jewish synagogues because they find the worship service there interesting. They have themselves become converted maybe to a belief that the God of Israel is God. But the process of conversion to Judaism is really stark. I mean, they have to go through a lot, including for the men being circumcised and so on. And so they are called God-fearers because they fear the God of Israel, and they are participating in the worship without fully converting. And so then Paul, who comes in and says to them, here's the new good news, and the Messiah has come. Here's the Messiah, who is the Christ, is the Greek word for that. And guess what? You also don't have to, obey Jewish law in order to be part of this. Mm-hmm. And so once Paul creates that easier way to convert, he starts to be able to plant large numbers of churches. And so he's very important because he's not the only one, because he clearly other people have done that. He has a bunch of enemies, and
competitors.
He has competitors. But also, it's clear from his letter to the Romans that there are lots of other people who have kind of gone down this path already, because he is writing, when he's writing to the Romans, what's called the Romans, but it's to the Christian communities that are at Rome, that this is an established Christian community that he didn't plant. So there's other people that are doing this too. So he's important, but we shouldn't overstate it. There are other people who have actually gone down the same path of also converting God-fearers and then other non-Jewish Christians. But he is important. So then he probably for a while is way less important. And so therefore he's not as important to some of these other writers who are actually the writers who produce the Gospels at the end of the first century. But then once people in the second century start collecting whatever texts they have, they realize they have these important letters that Paul wrote, and they are the earliest surviving texts. And so then he becomes more important again, because these texts then start to take on a life of their own when they become canonized, when we actually have a canon. And then Paul becomes more important again. And then he becomes especially important because of Protestants, in the Protestant Reformation, and Protestants emphasized Paul. And so I think he's too important, probably, in modern times. I mean, we shouldn't take him as authoritative. He's a guy. He's an early Christian who has a vision of what Christianity should be. He has a lot of theological ideas, but he is antagonistic to other first century writers. And what we actually should do is, look at them all. And several of them have their own distinct perspectives, which are also interesting, but they have to all be read within their limitations and biases the same way. We have to look at Paul and his blind spots.
All right, and I see another question. I'm not sure I understand this one. From Capacity for Joy, it says, curious about your thoughts regarding specific place-centric religious traditions versus those that freely flow to other regions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I presume that means, when you have when you set apart a land as holy, right?
Uh-huh.
And so, well, the ones that are that are really, well, so it's hard to say. So sometimes actually we have to remember that in Judaism, for example, even though there is a holy land, the religion has actually primarily been created and practiced in diaspora. So in other words, it's been created and practiced by people who aren't in the land.
Right, but that's why the question is about traditions, which doesn't necessarily mean what we read in the text, but what people do.
Place-centric traditions. So for example, that would be like the Hajj. So you have to go, a good Muslim, one of the things that you're supposed to do in the course of your life, if you're able to, a good Muslim makes the pilgrimage to Mecca once in their life. And, and I think that there is something to be said for just an amazing experience that you can have like that within a religious tradition. I don't know. I think that there's problems with it too, because it gives then the custodian of that site like all kinds of extra influence and power over the shaping of the religion than they might otherwise have. And that has, I would say, in that particular case in the 20th,
Yeah, you
21st
understand the
century.
question in one way, and I understand it in other way.
Okay,
the way
you answer it then.
Yeah, so that's a good one. The way I understand that question is, if you have a tradition, and let's say you have the same religion, and in place A, there's a tradition which doesn't exist on place B. Like, for example, I grew up celebrating, like we would get as kids our gifts not on Christmas, but on January 6th, when the camels would come back and you had to put your shoes on the balcony with a little bit of food for the camels, and then you woke up in the morning and you had your gifts there. So that's a different tradition.
Thank heavens we have reindeer in Canada that can fly and get the presents by Christmas morning.
Yeah, it creates a lot of anxiety.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's nice that there are alternate traditions. I think that, it's harder, in terms of that, it's harder now that we're all connected globally on the planet, and the mega culture starts to stamp out all of our individual distinctives that we've had all around. And so in as much as people are able to, preserve the traditions about when the camels come, I think that's kind of fun. So I like those.
Nick C. says, you've said a few times that Jesus quotes that his followers don't have to obey Old Testament law is attested multiple times and verges on historical. But how do you square that in Matthew 5:17? What is Matthew 5:17?
So that's, do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So the way I square that is that, again, all of these texts in the Bible have different perspectives. They contradict each other. The different authors are making different arguments. And so yes, the Matthean community is a community that continues to practice some component of Jewish law. Not Jewish law as understood in modern rabbinic Judaism, in other words, with all those number of commandments and that kind of thing, but they are doing something in order to, whatever the limited amount of things that Galilean Israelites might have felt are necessary in order to keep kosher. And they continue to think it's important in the Matthean community to do that. And that is an argument that lots of Christians in the first century, in the beginning was the majority, and increasingly became a minority, and ultimately, by the 4th century, becomes a heresy. And so their voice continues to be represented in the text of Matthew. But that's why we don't, that's why, anyway, we get the opposite. We can have verses that say the opposite things. So you can't just take the Bible as a set of commandments. We have to instead understand principles from them, because every single one of the different teachings is mediated through the authors. And so the Matthean community produces that in order to justify their position.
There's an interesting question from Kinetic that came in the chat, and I think it's a question to think about. I think it would be fun to hear what others have to say about this question. So if you have thoughts about this, just do type your answers in the chat. Here's the question, and I'm also going to put it here in the chat again. Here goes. Boom, chat. Does the disciples' path start at the inner or the outer point of the spiral? Can you talk more about the dimensional symbolism that you incorporate into this design? So what do you think? It's like starts in the middle or on the outer end?
Well, so since the
think?
you tell us what you think, but anyway, I would just say since the symbol came into Community of Christ because of the built sacred space of the temple.
Yeah.
and so the temple has a an actual ramp, a spiral ramp around its outer edge that's going into the sanctum. And so that is called the worshipper's path. And so you come from the outside of the spiral and you go upward and inward until you get into the inner sanctuary that then you can look up and see the spiral. It's going up to heaven. And so, so the imagery and the symbolism of the temple as it's built would be from the outside going inward as you're approaching the divine. And then when you commune in the sanctum with the divine, and then you go back out into the world and to share that. That would be how, and that's how I picture it, but you don't have to picture it that way.
And I have to say, if it's like, if the talk of disciples' path is a little off-putting for you and your spirituality or your philosophical stance, you can also think about like the spiritual maturity or like the growth as a person starts, like it starts from within or starts from going from the outside and to discover something that is at the core. I always thought of it more in the way that the sun goes around the galactic center.
Okay.
So really not that you're actually falling into the vortex, but you're just going around, crossing the spiral arms, and as you do, like the spiral arms are like, kind of like this challenges that you find. So I have a totally different understanding.
That's different from my way. Yeah, that's
spiral.
interesting. I've never heard that. I like that.
All right. More from Hislang. Is this about, well, there's the Pledge of Allegiance, but we already answered that. But Hislang also says, have you ever looked into the Book of Mormon for the least of these, a social justice commentary on the text? I haven't.
So we have, so within Community of Christ tradition, we have a couple good thinkers who are working on, who talk about a social justice and especially peace, pulling peace narratives out of the Book of Mormon. These are good friends of mine, Andrew Bolton in the United Kingdom, L. Ray Henriksen in Norway. And so I'm definitely familiar with like presentations and papers and work that they have done at it. I haven't read the Book of Mormon for the least of these, but I'm presuming that that Andrew and L. Ray would. The reason why I haven't is mostly is that I'm not really a Book of Mormon guy. I've never got really attached to it as a Mormon kid. I look at it similarly to any of the pseudepigraphical books that we have in the biblical canon, like the Book of Daniel. In other words, is written centuries after the events are supposed to have taken place, and so it is can provide some interesting ideas. I like some. There's a few verses out of the Book of Mormon that have some good ideas, but unfortunately I find it less. The text to be less compelling than some of our other books. So it's not just me personally. So I haven't really focused on that. But we do have other leaders in the church who do have that kind of focus and are especially what the point that Andrew and L. Ray say is that really since Joseph Smith grew up in poverty, he understands poverty. It's not it's sort of like. Joseph Smith's authorship of this is sort of like the historical Jesus as well, where there is a movement that emerges out of a very, let's say, common working class kind of religiosity that is then taken over and institutionalized by, in the case of Christianity, the elite of the Roman Empire. In the case of Mormonism, at least the people who control the state of Utah, but in other words, they've elevated it from what the original thinkers are, and so as a result, the text in the source text is, you'll have things like in Jesus saying, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter heaven, and the Book of Mormon is also filled with condemnation of people who are focused on property, and instead it is constantly calling on people to share and be in order to give to the poor in order so that everybody can live together.
Okay, we have a long, is it a comment? No, it's a question from K. Tempest Bradford. It's for you and for me too.
Okay.
A few weeks ago, John was telling me about Joseph, son of Israel, in the chat, but I'd love to hear history and thoughts on this from both him and me. Why isn't there a tribe of Israel named for Joseph, but instead his sons? And why his whole story is so key to a major aspect of Israelite identity. For example, being in Egypt from generations, yet he also seems isolated from the other 11 sons of Israel. Do you remember this conversation?
Yeah. So again, we have to remember that that these are not. This is not a family. These are not historical people. None of these people existed. And instead, when the authors are creating these stories, what you're starting out with is you have people who already are named. You have already existing ethnic groups, and you have like a magic number like 12, and so you're wanting to get to 12, and so it's essentially, how do we have so you're starting like this. Let's say here in Canada. So we would begin with the fact that we have Ontario, we have Quebec, we have Saskatchewan, we have New Brunswick, and so then we would create a story for how is Quebec related to Ontarius, and how are they related?
You should write that story.
Yeah,
fun.
And so what they're doing here is that these are eponymous ancestors. In other words, you have a place, it's called Canada. So Canada is the mother of all of these 15, children or something like that, or maybe 12 children and
right.
whatever the Northwest Territories, is, and things like that. And so why isn't there a Joseph? So the idea of it is that Joseph is a name that is kind of synonymous with the whole Northern Kingdom, and it's also therefore synonymous with Israel. So and with Jacob. So Joseph, Jacob, and Israel are all sort of like about the Northern Kingdom, which is the real kingdom of Israel. We've talked about how the unified kingdom under David and Solomon is a myth, and so when they're creating this these stories, they're creating them in the Northern Kingdom, and has creating some stories, and the Southern Kingdom is creating some stories, and they're coming together and being written down after the Northern Kingdom has fallen and exiles have moved south, and then after the Southern Kingdom has fallen and exiles have moved to Babylon. And so why have they taken that name Joseph? Because the two centers of the north are Ephraim and Manasseh, and what they're doing is they're showing that Ephraim and Manasseh have a closer unity together. And so that's why they are, the eponymous ancestry they're saying is these are tribes, but they are actually, both of them are the sons of the most important son. And so that's how the myth gets made. So there isn't just 12 tribes. There's a bunch of other tribes that don't make it on the list. There are all kinds of other biblical books, like we've seen in Judges, where they have different lists and they have some other tribes that didn't make it. Mm-hmm. And Judges is preserving some older texts, but we have to look at it from the opposite direction from the biblical direction. This is not a genealogy of actual people. This is people trying to describe the eponymous ancestor for their ethnic group. So why did Ohias get together with Kentuckia, and they decided to go down. They were the married couple, and or whatever it is.
Yeah,
So.
but it's also you want to make sure that you have 12 tribes, right? So once you kick, because it's a special number,
right?
So once you kick Levi out of the inheritance, then you need one more. You have to make sure that the number of tribes remain 12.
Yeah, but that didn't have to happen that way. And there's a bunch of other weird ones that where a tribe is strange. And there's other tribes that didn't make it, like Gilead or something, which is in other words, there's a bunch of other tribes.
It's messy, like the tribe situation. But in your, I think there's also like the issue of land inheritance, and like the most important son, which usually would be the eldest son, would get double inheritance. And isn't that making it also? Is making a claim that, this is the most important son, and this is why it gets double inheritance, not just one land.
But he's not the oldest.
No, he's not the oldest. But he becomes, that's a statement.
Okay,
that's
I see what you're saying, Yeah, so that's another thing too. So there's also a inherent narrative within the Yahweh source, especially of the Torah, where they're constantly telling the narrative of the lesser son, the younger son of supplanting the older son. So there's a bunch of these, themes that are just part of what they're talking about.
Istvan asks to me, you mentioned before regarding Bible translations that you disagree with some of the New Revised Standard Versions translators' decisions. Do you have any specific examples of these? And also, what Bible translation do you prefer in Spanish? The one, for example, translation decision that I remember off the top of my head that I find problematic is in that in the Gospel of Luke, there is a saying of Jesus that says that the least of these shall be the greatest. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing it, but this is a scene where all the disciples are fighting to arguing about who is the greatest disciple, and then Jesus grabs a little boy and he puts it in the middle of the argument and says, "This little child here is the greatest." Now, actually, the Greek doesn't say that the kid or the least shall be the greatest. The Greek original just say the least shall be great. So in my interpretation of the Greek is that there is no greatest. Everyone is great, no matter if you're the smallest kid and the most insignificant disciple, or you're the most prominent disciple. Everyone is at the same level of greatness. There is no great test. The NRSV and other translations say greatest because it grammatically works, because otherwise it's a grammatically awkward sentence. So that's one example where actually by the NRSV using greatest instead of great, a lot of people reading that conclude a rather romantic interpretation of the text by saying, the poor and the kids are actually more important than everyone else. And so you had people like I have encountered in congregational life who say the most important member of this congregation is this little baby. And that we need to put all our eggs into this little cute smiley basket, which is wonderful, but that's not what the original text actually says. And my go-to translation in Spanish is the Nueva Biblia de las Américas, not because it's perfect, it also has a lot of issues, but I think a lot of times that translation is when the translators don't agree on what the translation is, because these are translations made by a team, not one person. And that's very important. Sometimes all the translators don't agree on what word to use, and so you're going to find at the end of the chapter that will say, well, this word could also be this, or could also mean that. And another thing that the New Revised Standard Version does is that it solves sometimes gender issues, because now we try to read scripture and just in a more gender neutral way, but the Greek is not gender neutral. So that's another thing that the New Revised Standard Version tries to fix, to help modern readers just try to understand this, what these ancient authors are saying beyond the limitations of gender.
Yeah.
But however, gender is there. The Greek language is gendered. English is not. But all translations are ultimately problematic.
One thing that I remember finding that I was really surprised about in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the one you use, is that I'm pretty sure, anyway, if I'm remembering this right, is when we were doing the lecture on Asherah, the potential the consort of Yahweh in the Canaanite pantheon, the Israelite pantheon, original one, that a lot of places it hides.
It hides
Asherah, and it talks about a grove or pole. It translates it instead of understanding, well, this is an Asherah pole and this is a sacred grove, a grove sacred to Asherah. Instead, so I think it makes it. It seems. I kind of remember that I was surprised that the NRSV had kind of seemed to hide that.
Yeah, it's like, what was wrong with this tree? And same thing, like Kinetic is asking if we have read the David Bentley Hart New Testament translation. I have encountered that translation.
Yeah, we've encountered it.
As when I'm doing exegetical work, but I prefer translations that are made by a team, not by one person in general. There's a lot of scholars who write commentaries, who use their own translations of the Greek in their commentary, and I think that's great, because they're actually not only translating the Greek for you, but they're also they're explaining what it means. So in that case, and they often explain why the choice of word.
Yeah.
But that's what a commentary, like a deep theological commentary, is supposed to do, especially if you provide your own translation. I would like to have a commentary that uses David's translation. I don't, but if I have to rely on a translation, I often prefer a translation that is made by multiple people, not one.
Yeah, we have a great commentary and with its own translation by Luke Timothy Johnson of Luke, and really like that gospel.
Julie Wizewski says, could you give 1 or 2 lectures on indigenous spirituality, perhaps even what is known about the Mayan, Aztec, or Inca religions? We had one lecture on in First Nations spirituality, but we should go back into this topic.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, we did, but it was like that was one of the very first things that we did. Yeah. So it's an interesting idea, though.
Let's continue. Well, there's a lot of questions coming in the chat. We hardly touched the questions that came in before.
Well, we've got plenty of time.
But this is great. Keep sending us questions. A cat named Dorak also asked, any comments, James Tabor elevating John the Baptist as the original and Jesus just taking over once John was executed? I think we have talked about this in several lectures, and especially in your lecture on John the Baptist and this effort that different authors, gospel authors, do to sort of minimize the importance on John the Baptist. But can we extrapolate that to conclude that actually the original sage or the original Messiah was John the Baptist as opposed to the Jesus?
Well,
I don't know if that's what the question
say that about
goes.
Messiah, I mean, the original. But even though he's saying original, he doesn't say original Messiah there. And so what?
I don't know what the original what.
Yeah. So we've talked about that in our lecture on the historical Jesus, like Leandro says. So in several places, and so one of the points that all of our sources agree is that Jesus is associated with John the Baptist at the beginning of his ministry, and even Josephus, as we were talking about, not our Christian historian from the first century, talks about both John the Baptist and then Jesus, and then the brother of Jesus, James, which is kind of like the order that we know about the leader, about leaders from both the Gospels and from Paul.
Right.
And so even Q begins with John the Baptist sayings and then moves to Jesus sayings. Mark begins with John the Baptist, and then all the canonical Gospels do. And so I think that the majority opinion among scholars of the historical Jesus is that the historical Jesus will have begun his career as a disciple of John the Baptist, and then John the Baptist is executed, and so then Jesus goes on his own and has his own more successful movement and ministry. The other idea of it is maybe there's just a general movement that they're all kind of a part of. People like James and John and Jesus, out of which Jesus becomes much more important later because of the later understanding that Christians have, as opposed to the Jesus people movement that reveres lots of leaders. And so, for example, Q calls both John and Jesus sons of wisdom. There's the idea that they are the blood of prophets, that Jesus has sealed his testimony in blood just as John did. So in other words, there might be a movement that sort of reveres them all, but then Jesus gets understood as being more important as Christian theology develops under influence of people like Paul and other early Christian ministers. And so yeah, I think that that's definitely mainline understanding as we try to reconstruct the life of the historical Jesus.
Sorry, I'm smiling at the questions that come in the chat.
Okay.
Great questions. The next question that I see here, I don't have an answer, but maybe John, you do, from Dartha Rama. What do you think about the Moses scroll? Do you believe Shapira? Like, of course I've heard about the Moses scroll, but I don't know much about it.
We'll have to get that for you for the next one of these as I look at whatever the most recent things have been said about it. There was a view, of course, that it was a forgery, but there's some new looking into it. So let's look at it in more detail.
Yeah, we'll mark it for the next Q&A. We have here, let me see, a question from Okapi002. Is there any hypothesis suggesting that Mary was actually Joseph's daughter rather than his wife? That would explain why she was significantly younger and still a virgin. It could also clarify how Jesus is considered the Son of God while still being a descendant of King David. Additionally, it might help account for the differences between two genealogies in the Gospels. I guess that's, I'd never heard any ever read any commentaries or historical analysis that suggests that. It sounds to me like a what if kind of scenario, just speculation that cannot be proven or disproved.
No, it's not. I mean, there's nothing in our sources that would say anything of the kind in terms of being a daughter rather than wife. In terms of significantly younger, that's just a tradition. So that's coming out of the Proto-Evangelium. In other words, it's coming from much later, 2nd century sources that have no historicity. The differences between the two genealogies are because the individual gospel writers are creating those. So those are not genealogies that have historicity. And so the Joseph himself has, resting on very little. Because again, he's not around in the, there are other places where Jesus is son of Mary, so Mary is a little bit better attested. The idea that Jesus' mother is still there is canonically in all of the Gospels. Joseph is only in Matthew and Luke, who each use that name, and so it's known anyway. But there's never a statement, Jesus, son of Joseph. That's nowhere.
Right.
So anyway, so I would say even Joseph is a little less attested, as I'm being more of a minimalist here, and the idea that he's a lot older. I mean, she's young for sure. The idea that he's a lot older, I don't think is explicit, except for in the Proto-Evangelium. So in other words, in the non-canonical sources.
And would that be in the case of Mary, that Mary is mentioned in the Gospels? Would that qualify as to add to her historicity because of this? I can't find a word. The thesis of embarrassment.
Embarrassment, yeah. So the earliest Gospel, Mark, portrays Mary and Jesus' siblings as being hostile to his movement, because there's rumors that he has a demon in him. The Mary and her children believe that, and they kind of go and try to find him, and his disciples say, your mom and your brothers and sisters are trying to find you, and he says, who are my brothers and my sisters and my mother? All of you are. So in other words, he's renouncing his biological family in Mark. That said, that there's, again, we have to read all of these sources with their own biases. We know that the historical Jesus' brother ends up being the leader of the church in Jerusalem, of the movement after Jesus' death. And so Mark seems to be potentially hostile to that leader. And so maybe that's why he's the author of Mark. May be undermining that, is what I would actually suggest. It's because there's a lot of complexity here, but no, I would say it is not an idea. There's no basis anywhere in any of our sources that Mary could be Joseph's daughter.
Casey D. Premium says, in the beginning of Samuel, it talks about the temple at Shiloh in a way that seems like more than just a tabernacle. Is this an anachronism? Are there other ideas of a pre-Solomonic temple?
So it's probably not an anachronism. Shiloh would have been one of the. There would have been lots of temples besides the temple at Jerusalem. So as the Israelite kingdoms are developing, they have inherited traditions. And the actual historical experience is that they are regular polytheists or pagans, and they would have had lots of different temples and shrines, the high places, and so on. And Shiloh is one of these traditional places of a shrine with priesthood, and so that this is the people that are producing, like you say, this kind of legendary great prophet of Samuel, but also potentially, I think, associated with Jeremiah, who is a historical prophet, might be related to the priesthood from Shiloh. And so then there's other great shrines and temples too. So the Northern Kingdom had its own temple centers, including the one that was closest to the Southern Kingdom, which is at Bethel, the house of God. And so, yeah, there would have been, like you say, there probably would have been at least a shrine here. In other words, another temple that later, the later priestly author of the Bible wants to make it so no legitimate temple exists other than the Jerusalem temple, and no one ever legitimately offered a sacrifice, including Levites. Only Aaron and Aaron's descendants, who they themselves claim to be, or understand themselves to be.
We have a question from David Latorre. I wonder how 12 and 40 became magic numbers for the Canaanite culture. And I would say to that it's not just Canaanite culture, but it's in ancient Near Eastern
Mesopotamian culture.
12 in general. 12 it comes from astronomy, from the observation of how the stars move. 40.
They picked 12.
Yeah,
when they were doing it.
Because it helps with their maths.
The base number.
It's the base number.
The numbering system of the Babylonians.
Right. Yeah. But in 40, I think it just means a long time. I don't know why 40 and not 50, maybe because that's what people were expected to live in those days. I don't know, but it's just a long time, and it usually is not just Canaan; it's other cultures in the region.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so, for example, with that same magic number of 12 got exported, and that made the number of Olympian gods too, and things, right? So that just had become from the Mesopotamians a sacred number. Like you say, 40. I don't think that's as universal at all. I mean, it just becomes the number. It may just be, like you say, big because there's 40 days and 40 nights isn't often used, but then also it's the number of what a generation traditionally is, and so. You're 40 years wandering in the wilderness, that means that the whole generation dies. The same thing happens in the book of Judges. 40 years is a generation. So
the history of the number 40.
Yeah, we'd have to look that up. Yeah.
That's the next lecture. Was Yahweh a deity imported and adopted by ancient Canaanites? Most likely, no. So Canaan, at least what we know about ancient Canaanite religion, which is very little, and most of it comes from the tablets found at Ugarit, the city in Syria, in modern-day Syria near the coast. There's absolutely no mention of Yahweh in this library, and this is the most extensive Canaanite library that we have from the late Bronze Age. The name of Yahweh also doesn't appear in other sources that are like in Egyptian sources or Assyrian sources that predate the rise of Israel. So the theories that I know of are the Kenite hypothesis that suggests that Yahweh was a god of the desert, of these people that the Bible calls the Kenites. So it came from somewhere in Arabia. There has been a lot of modern research in the last few years on the origins, the potential connection between Yahweh and the peoples of Arabia that I still haven't read, but it's an exciting topic, and I definitely want to talk more about that in a future lecture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Kenites are also Canaanites, right?
No, they're not. What are they? No, it's Kenite.
I know, but they're living in Canaan. I mean, they're not part of the same ethnicities. In other words, I'm saying that the Ugaritic people, the Phoenicians, the Aramites,
they are a Semitic people, but they're not. I don't think they are considered Canaanites.
I just didn't. It's sometimes, like all of these ethnicities, Israelites and Moabites, they're all Canaanites.
Yeah, these are maybe they might be from some perspectives, but it's like the people who are in the desert that is at least in the era of the great Canaanite cities. All the Canaanite cities are either on the coast or in the fertile parts of the valleys of Israel, Palestine. So that's where the core of Canaanite culture is. These are peoples who live in the fringes, in the desert, which have a very, very different material culture.
Okay.
So that's usually when we say Canaanite, we refer to their material culture because that's most of what we have is the archaeological remains, with the exception of this big library from Ugarit. Yeah. Which we don't have for these people whom we call the Kenites, the Kenites.
Yes, right.
But it's the name sounds very.
Well, I wasn't thinking it was the same name. I was just saying a lot of these ethnic groups are all
Julie Bizevsky asked, the impact of Greco-Roman philosophers on Christianity is well recognized. Did Egyptian religion or mythology affect early Christianity to any significant respect?
Well, so I would say that it gets more indirect by the time we're getting to the Christian period. So Egyptian religion and mythology, has some influence and flavor at the very earliest stages of Israelite religion. And so for, like First Temple, especially early Second Temple, Judaism is still having some of those influences. And so, for example, within the wisdom tradition, some of the, a book of Egyptian sage, of an Egyptian sage is taken wholesale and brought into and translated into and become part of the book of Proverbs. And the book of Proverbs is part of then the wisdom tradition that then has an influence that continues on, including Jesus is participating in that wisdom tradition because he operates more as a sage usually than as a prophet. And so I would say there is, but it's pretty indirect. And so one of the things that because of the language, because of the Babylonians actually taking exiles to Babylon, the Egypt and Mesopotamia are the two great influences on Canaanites altogether, but in Israelite religion, there's maybe more emphasis and more influence that the Mesopotamians have at kind of a critical moment of biblical composition. And then later, Egypt has a big effect, but it is Hellenized Egyptians. And so it is all of these Macedonians and Greeks that live in Alexandria with the largest Jewish community and also one of the most important early Christian communities, the community of Alexandria, which is one of the Patriarchate of Alexandria is one of the main thinkers and leaders of Christianity in the first many centuries. But it's a little removed from indigenous Egyptians because it has been so thoroughly Hellenized. It's become the capital of Greek thought.
Right. So you're saying that it's like what we have here is a case where Christianity and also the diaspora Jewish community are primarily a city culture, and it's not so much that where maybe like the more indigenous religions of Egypt would be present.
Well, right, and in other words, but they're in a city in Egypt, And so what I'm going to say is the stratum. I know, but the stratum is there, right? Yeah. So in other words, so no matter what, by the time it gets to the end, Cleopatra is the first pharaoh, the Ptolemy that actually learns Egyptian. They dress like it. In other words, there are things that are present in the culture. So there is going to be some effect, but I would say that it's not as direct anymore. Some people have argued that Egyptian ideas of afterlife are one of the sources for the ideas of resurrection. So, but it's not clear because there also exists in the Middle East. So,
I have a question from Amanda Zabo, and also thank you for your gift to the channel to support our lectures. This came in a comment. In a previous lecture, you gave a beautiful description of how Catholics view transubstantiation. I can't find it, but I want to share it with my husband. Can you summarize it or point me to that lecture? We do have a lecture on that.
We did. We had a whole lecture on transubstantiation. I don't know. We can give a link to it in the chat. We just always remind you that if you want to, the easiest place, I know there's so many lectures now, the easiest way to find it is go to centerplace.ca/lectures, and you get the whole list, and you do a keyword search and find transubstantiation. That would have pulled that up. But there's a whole lecture on transubstantiation. The idea of it was that there is a difference in terms of Greco-Roman and therefore then later Western philosophical and theological ideas. There's a difference between the idea of material and the idea of a substance. So a substance is understood a reality that can be immaterial, and whereas material is actual stuff, right? And so when something is, we're not saying, the Catholic understanding here is not that not transmaterialization. It is not a transporter device or a replicator that in Star Trek that takes inert matter, beams it up, and then it turns it into a hot fudge sundae. which is what transmaterialization in Star Trek is. It's transubstantiation. So what it does is it's taking a substance, which is materially is bread, but bread has the purpose of nourishment. So its substance is a form of nourishment for the physical body, and it changes the substance to the substance of Christ, which is God and love and so forth. So now the purpose of this emblem is to connect you to God and to have God within you and so forth. It's not about so we might think it's change of purpose as opposed to change of material. Although there are plenty of modern Catholics who don't make that distinction and do think of it as maybe the material thing. That is not what it was meant anyway.
Right, so we're talking about, when we say the word substance and transubstantiation, we're talking about the same concept of substance that we have when we say that the Father and the Son are of the same substance.
But they're different, distinct persons, right?
Right.
So that's so they have the same purpose. They have the same essential being.
Essence.
Yeah, essence.
But it doesn't. That has nothing to do with matter.
Not about matter.
I have a question here, and it's about, this one came in on the lecture, Will Christianity Survive?
Okay.
From Baby Love 77. Could John please talk more about the reasons for the decline of Christianity or generally organized religion? I think you talked a lot about that, but
yeah.
Any other thoughts you had this week?
Well, I mean, like I say, I think that there's a huge component of this is the very positive trend of people being able to be individuals themselves, so that you can chart your own path. You aren't simply adopting your parents' identity and living on like that and just replicating their lives in that way. And so when we are as we've all been able to do that, organized religion in general, not just churches, organized religion in general hasn't adapted to that by understanding that you have to have a reason for people to then want to opt into it, as opposed to just that you have to out of obligation. So, and so this is why I was suggesting that this is happening at every level, but the institutions, the organizations that were the most sophisticated, that had, let's say, the most people with the most college degrees and so forth, right, first, they are further along in terms of the unraveling and decline, and the ones that are way further back are hitting the same trend only later, in the same way that we did with the demographic things, where there are some countries that have reached lack of replacement rate much earlier and are declining way faster, but they're all on track to get to that same place. And so I think that's I think that's kind of a core issue, is that that organized religion has not been good in terms of the modern realm of competition for eyeballs, because it has largely not reinvented itself and for the new reality that we're all living in. And so, I
also wonder, when you read texts from the early 19th century about what was happening in the cities of North America, like New York, you see that there's this urban population that had nothing to do. They were working in factories, and there was absolutely, nothing to do in the cities other than just work. There were not even parks in these cities. And so the people had two options. Men had two options for entertainment, the tavern and church. And for women, unfortunately, it was only church. Right. So now there's a lot of competition for our attention, and a lot of much better quality entertainment that you can access. Whereas in the past, church was pretty much the only thing that the working class people would have had access to just not think about work.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that happened too, as all of those other options were evolving, this is one of the reasons why tariffs don't work. I shouldn't mention this, but anyway, I don't want to get political here. This is an economic thing. And so the economics here of it is, so churches were able to lobby to prevent anybody from being able to do anything fun on a Sunday. So, or even go shopping and stuff. So you couldn't go shopping, you couldn't go to the theater. None of the things that were evolving as alternatives were allowed to be done on Sunday. And so then the church was protected and able to continue to be really boring and continue to be, like a thing that people otherwise wouldn't want to go to, but they just did because there was nothing else to do. And then when that tariff was removed, your weak industry can't compete with all the other things that have grown and been able to thrive in a competitive marketplace. So it just got overwhelmed, And so this is why protectionism anyway, is a problem.
Right, there's a question that just came in the chat and from Anders and Lister, and many thanks for supporting the channel with your super chat. And Anders says, Hamer has such thorough biblical knowledge. Is there any part of the Bible or biblical history that John feels he doesn't know enough about? Where would he be on shaky ground knowledge-wise? Sorry if I sound like a fanboy.
Oh, thanks, Anders. You have to continually learn and study. And actually, this is a wonderful part of the practice that we have been having in our own church on Sunday. So the way we operate our themes and Beyond the Walls, we have been devoting an entire year to different study, right? And so we began 3 years ago with a deep study of the Gospel of Luke. We went to Matthew. We're doing John now. I'm so much more familiar with the Gospel of John and the Johannine community and things like that as a result of having spent the whole year really thinking about that in the context. And just to answer your question, next year we're going to do a whole rest of the New Testament kind of stuff. When I say rest, so in other words, the non-gospel parts. And so I'm actually looking forward to doing a much more thorough dive into both the letters of Paul, the letters that are attributed to Paul, all of the other letters, too. We're doing a little bit of the Johannine letters right now, but we'll do James and so forth. And I'm going to be a lot more knowledgeable about all of those once I've really studied them, spent a bunch of time reading them and having them be the focus of our weekly themes. Once I've done that. That's just a matter of, you get more familiar and you think about things more when you spend a lot of time on and focus on it.
And I think it was something that happened this year as we decided to go into the Gospel of John that was probably not your favorite.
Yeah, no, it had been my least favorite.
Because of this lack of historicity issue, yeah. But then it really forces you to try to understand the author in context.
And now I kind of like it.
Now you kind of like it. But now, okay. So that takes me to a question that I think is a very important question from Yoshiyam 4026, who says, can someone help me understand the difference between exegesis and hermeneutics?
Oh, and you had a whole lecture on exegesis.
Right, I had a whole lecture on exegesis, but I guess I have the bias of a theologian.
Yeah.
And so, as opposed to a simple, the bias that an archaeologist or a Bible historian might have, which is more factual, as a theologian, we do exegesis to remember that the word exegesis suggests drawing out of the text without reading into the text your own biases, your own agenda. So that's what exegesis means. So exegesis is not about the reader, about the interpreter, but about the text. So in exegesis, you have to imagine almost like having the text inside a sealed room, and you're like the scientist behind the glass, looking with instruments at this book to just try to understand the book without contaminating it with your own biases, right? Now, but as a theologian, or if you're a minister, you do the exegetical process, and then you continue with the hermeneutical process, which is now what? We found out what the text was intended to be, what the author's intention was, and what it meant to the original audience. That's what exegesis tells us. The hermeneutical step asks, okay, we know that, and now what does it mean for us today? What do we do today with this text that meant such and such for an ancient audience? Now, does it continue to have any value for modern readers? So hermeneutics is more like a philosophy on or a theoretical approach to ancient text that you understand was not written with you in mind, but then explores the relationship between this text and the modern reader. That's what hermeneutics is about. Now, the problem is, for a theologian, we always kind of mesh the two things together, because you ultimately want to find value for readers today. We have, let's see if we have any other questions.
We do a lot of that, therefore, on Sunday, right? Because we're very a lot of emphasis on how is this relevant today. So, so I appreciate what you're saying.
In a way, you could say that and this is going back to the question about why not separating the what we do on Tuesdays and what we do on Sundays in this channel is, well, the Tuesday approach is more exegetical, sort of. And the Sunday approach is more hermeneutical, which includes the exegetical approach, but it goes a little bit beyond.
Yeah, I would say that. I would call it that way too.
We have a question from the Fifth World, 22nd, 22. There's a lot more to this name center place. I would be curious to know why you chose it. I was watching something last night about petroglyphs in America, and they were talking about the center place. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know about the meaning of the word center place in the context. If it's petroglyphs, is I guess the context of the indigenous Americans, of the First Nations peoples. We chose it from a restoration tradition. So we have this idea. So when our church was founded in the early 19th century, they were literalists. We talked about the rapture still hasn't happened, at least to my knowledge, this evening. And so,
are you sure?
Well, we're still here anyway. If it has already happened, we've been left behind, sadly. So the earliest members of our church also were apocalyptic literalists who believed the world was going to end in a very literal way within just a few years. And so they also felt that they were called to kind of to build the kingdom of God on earth right now, before anything, or maybe to set conditions into place to allow for this cosmic thing to end. And so they took this name out of the Bible, Zion, which is described, it means Jerusalem, but the heavenly Jerusalem, the idea of a people that there's no poor among them, because everyone thinks of the other and gives to one another in order to live in a just and peaceable society. And so they wanted to know in the early, the church got going in the 1830s, where are we going to build this new Jerusalem? Do we all need to go to the Ottoman Empire, which is, and where the old Jerusalem was, and start building there? And by the way, some of the members did go do that. We talked about that. No, they decided, no, the place to build the center place for the city of Zion, as they called it, is Independence, Missouri, which is in the center of the North American continent. And so that's why our church's temple headquarters is in this weird place of Independence, Missouri. But we just took that that phrase, center place, the center place for the city of Zion, and because center is spelled different in Canada, we thought, okay, well, this will be a center place for a just and peaceable community for our sacred community here in Canada, and also because our community and ministry extends beyond the walls, is the name of our Sunday service, our sacred community, that we will nevertheless have a physical location that will be the kind of center place for that community to have as kind of a foundational core, but that extends, far beyond the walls. And so that's where the name comes from.
Another question that comes from Native American Cowboy. Can a real Christian explain to me why our lives appear to be going in needless circles? Example, my 50-year-old brother gave his life to Christ about 2 months ago, but he still hasn't gone to heaven. He's still here on earth dealing with repetitive things like needing food and paying rent. No different than me. So please explain why giving your life to Jesus still leaves you stuck here on earth, going in circles instead of being gone with Jesus.
Well, this is similar to the idea about the rapture, right? And so why hasn't, for people for whom they think that Christianity is about the rapture, unless they have left us behind, this is, in my opinion, a misinterpretation of what, or my view anyway, of what Christianity should be about. And so I think that we're not sitting here going around in circles. We are actually, hopefully, being called to live a meaningful life as disciples, as we attempt to build and foster communities of joy, hope, love, and peace, as we want things to be just, as we try to make the world a better place in all the different ways that we can do it. And so our focus anyway, is not on afterlife. That's something that you can worry about when you're not in this life. And in the meanwhile, in terms of getting stuck and having still having trouble and things like that, this life is not about, as the prosperity gospel would teach you, that if you do this and that and you give some pastor a lot of money, then suddenly you'll get rewarded with all kinds of money yourself. That's not, unfortunately, how that works. Because, for example, as Jesus teaches in Matthew 5:45, God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. God's mercy falls on the just and unjust. This is not about you do good in order to get a reward. You avoid doing evil in order to not be punished. It is about wanting to align yourself with love because you love for love's sake. Again, we don't want to have these mercenary motivations.
Another question, it's from Landgrab 4. What does the Gospel of John teach us about the historical Jesus?
Less than any of the other Gospels. So unfortunately, the Gospel of John has a very seriously theological focus, and it is not, for example, preserve much in the way of sayings that can be brought back to the historical Jesus. It is the dialogue that exists is written by the author and is not representing something that, or the authors is not representing something that goes back. It's something that is written for the narrative that the author is telling. And so in terms of the glimpses and memories and footprints or whatever that it has for the historical Jesus, it mostly is only helpful when it is, for my opinion, when it is echoing something that we have somewhere else. In other words, so then the Gospel of John is providing additional attestation because it has an independent tradition that is so very different from the synoptic tradition. If the Gospel of John also preserves like a variant of the saying, ask and you'll receive and it'll be open to you like it does, then that's like a rare point where the Gospel of John is providing an additional attestation. Another part of that is the like a couple things like the story of the feeding of the 5,000. In other words, where there's an additional overlap, some of the passion narrative is widely overlaps. It shows a tradition that is deeper than it otherwise would be. But if we only had, if we didn't have the other Gospels, if we only had the Gospel of John, then our knowledge of the historical Jesus would be much closer to the way that the knowledge of the historical Buddha, which is to say, mostly not anything to do with the historical Jesus, mostly a story or myth that is written to explain the understanding of Jesus as the Christ, in the same way that none of the story of the historical, of the Buddha it relates to the historical Buddha. Buddha, wasn't born and immediately everywhere he walks, lotus flowers appear, and then he's put into a pleasure palace by his dad and shielded from any kind of suffering until he finally gets out and sees it all. That is a story that is created by later Buddhists to explain how the historical Buddha, had the insights and enlightenment that is at the heart of the philosophy. So in other words, it's a story it's a myth that is created after.
The Chinese are more practical, right? Because I prefer the story of Lao Tzu. Remember?
Yeah.
He was in his mother's womb until the age of 80. So he was born an old, wise man.
Yeah. So that would be another example of, again, where we can't necessarily identify a historical Lao Tzu or anything about him. So if we only had the Gospel of John, I would just say we would know, precious little or a lot less about the historical Jesus than we do.
We have a question on the lecture of Akhenaten. Would it be possible for Moses, this question is from Pants on Fire, would it be possible for Moses to just be a historical Egyptian figure of influence or power who lived contemporary to Akhenaten and preached Atenism if we strip off his other biblical attributes? In other words, he would only be anachronistic to Jewish tradition. And I think we talked about this idea of equating or thinking of Moses as a priest of Akhenaten.
Well, right. We were saying that that's like a wild theory that was created by Freud and some others right at the beginning of this. So no, that's not how I would say history actually works as an academic discipline. This is the way we create speculative ideas that seem cool, but so the problem is, let's say if we take it out of the Jewish tradition and just want to have Moses input into Egyptian tradition all by itself, Moses isn't in the Egyptian records, and so Moses is not a figure that exists in the Egyptian tradition. What happens is that Moses comes into existence in the Jewish tradition much too late to have any knowledge of this, and so therefore there's no overlap. These are two distinct things that we know about, and so therefore we want to insert it.
I think with questions like this one, what we need to clarify is a little bit about the academic methodology. You have certain data, and you analyze this data, and then you come to conclusions. But then, does the data really sustain the conclusions that you're arriving to? And so I think it's often very frustrating to do scholarship because you really have to find evidence that is very difficult, and you have to use tons of footnotes, or you have to do your own archaeological research if that's not available. And then maybe at the end, your conclusions are not very exciting. And which is a problem because there's someone who is funding your research ultimately who's expecting your conclusions to wow the media so that you can continue to do research. So there's a little bit of a trap here. Like sometimes we really would like to connect dots, but that's really not how academia really works.
Well, and I think there's also just a desire on everybody's part a bias, where everybody would like to preserve as much of a story as if it were history. So in other words, this bias in favor of maximal historicity, and so therefore people, they go to the Exodus story and they say, well, there could have been the Red Sea parting because of such and such a thing happens with wind, or this kind of a thing. It's completely unnecessary description, though, because again, there is no eyewitnesses to this account. This is a literary story, the same as Perseus using the shield of Athena to cut off Medusa's head, and later using it to turn the sea monster into stone. We don't have to explain something about a mutation that caused a woman's hair to appear like snakes or something like that. That's not essential to understanding where the story came from. So.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that in our culture, even though we have embraced these stories from Greek myth, from Greek religion, no one is busily, at least some people might be, but not as many people.
They're doing it for the Trojan War.
Well, the Trojan War, yes, but
okay.
we know. I don't hear a lot of speculation about, like how was it possible that all these things happened in all these stories with the Cyclops and things like that.
But that was being done by Herodotus. And so in other words, so this tradition that people are still trying to apply to the Bible, which is something Josephus was doing in the first century, and it's something that Herodotus was doing centuries before that for all of the Greek myth, people are still applying that, and that's where this kind of ideas are. We just need to not worry about getting too caught up with our bias of historicity and get away from historicity.
Question from Dorota Korsak. I wanted to ask a theological question about Community of Christ belief. We know that the Jewish God has evolved from a wider pantheon of gods and changed so much during ages, modified by people who worshipped him and later his son according to their times and needs. How do you internalize this knowledge with belief in real God in your current religion? How you avoid thinking that the God is actually a human creation? Can you describe the good you're believing in? How do we know that our current view on God is the right one? Is he, I'm reading the question as it came, is he kind of supreme power, hard to really comprehend, and you may try to transcend to get to him by kind of symbolic representation of Christianity? So I think this is a question about how we today, and I would say not only in Community of Christ, but in a lot of mainstream Protestant churches and even the Catholic Church, how do we make sense of the fact that we go to seminary and we learn, or we are historians of the religion, and we learn about all these things that really there has been an evolution on how humans have understood God throughout the ages, and as humans wrote about God, sometimes as you say, we thought of a God that is very much like us, even in a God that has a particular gender, as you continue to refer to God as he, him.
Right.
And then now, once you understand that, the people who wrote these ancient texts in the past, had a view of God that doesn't match exactly what the view of God that we have today.
Well, it's very, very different,
And then also, the question is, but how do we know that people 500 years from now will look at our way of looking at God today, and they're going to say, oh my God, these people, can you believe the things that they were saying about God?
Right, well, no, exactly, So the first part of it is, this idea that God has evolved. It says, we know that God has evolved, right? Yeah, that's how it's
The
described.
Jewish God has evolved.
Right, that's what it's saying. And the God has changed, and so on. So I wouldn't say it that way at all. So in other words, the view of God has evolved is what I would say, as opposed to saying God has evolved. Same way, the view, let's look at it from the analogy of the cosmos. So we now know, about a lot about, the incredible size of the universe, all of the, clusters of galaxies and how far it is, and the fact that there is no center at all to the universe, all the other things that we are aware of, that it's expanding and it's not going to come back at any time. The people in Jesus' time, all of the biblical authors, probably to the extent that they know much about the cosmos, would have been now fully embraced the Greco-Roman cosmos, the Ptolemaic universe. They would have understood that the world is a sphere, the world is the earth is the center of the universe, and it's surrounded by the celestial spheres. It's not that the universe changed. That's what they understood it to be. If you go back, a few generations before to when, many generations, hundreds of years before, to when the Genesis and the Torah are being written, the earth is flat. There's the firmament, a dome above it. There's the waters of chaos all around. Again, the world has not changed. People's understanding of the cosmos is radically different because they knew so much less. So I would suggest that in the same way, when we're doing theology and philosophy, it's not that the idea of God changes. The human idea, the human understanding of the gods, have evolved, but not whatever the divine source is not evolved. And in terms of how do you know what we're doing is the right one? In other words, the current view is the right one. So that's a presentist perspective that can maybe be held by, again, all these people that are about to be raptured, because today is the end of time. But actually, that's just our presentist bias, because we living at the end of time from our perspective. But I will hope that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 1,000 years from now, that I'm the 40th pastor of this congregation, maybe the 80th pastor, if we're hopeful that the institution continues, we'll have much more sophisticated understandings of than I have, and that's wonderful, right? So
you just found some writings from a previous pastor of this congregation.
A leader, anyway, not pastor.
Leader of this congregation from 100 years ago that had pretty different views.
Well, he was still pretty much a I would call a apocalyptic literalist. So they're I think he's meaning this literally, but he had a revelation, and it was that the people were all going to be gathered to Zion's Hill, and then we would see the end times. So that was from the 1880s. So that was still very current, in this church more than a century ago. But anyway, it's actually more recently than that too.
Munbrook, from the lecture Who Wrote the Gospel, says, how can we trust anonymous books? I'll leave that question to you.
You don't have any insight into that? Yeah, so this is I'm responding to the fact that each of the canonical Gospels were written anonymously, and then in other words, they don't begin the way some books in the Bible, like the book of Tobit, do. I Tobit, write this book in text, or something like that. Although the problem, I would say that one's maybe more problematic because this is a pseudepigraphic book, and so some books aren't anonymous. They claim to be written by people which they aren't written by, and so maybe that is maybe less trustworthy, right. And so, for example, the epistles of Peter claim to be written by Peter, and they are not written by Peter. And so therefore, in some ways, we can trust them less maybe than we can trust anonymous books. It's possible to have an anonymous book be trustworthy if a person, let's say, is being called upon to write to express the traditions of the community. And so it's a community that isn't about honoring, lionizing leaders. And you could imagine where maybe a general statement of the community is what is emerged. You can imagine that could happen if you give a community prayer, or you all get together and create like a mission statement or something like that. It doesn't necessarily need an author statement. So I think there are reasons you could imagine where an anonymous text is presenting there's a reason why we don't want to lionize the individual, and that in part that the pseudepigraphic texts are maybe harder to justify. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this has to do a lot in especially in the what we call the religions of the book, because there is a canon, which in other traditions you don't have a canon.
Yeah.
So in Greco-Roman religion, there isn't really like a fixed canon. There are like stories,
right,
and there are authors that are actually recognized authors that are rewriting these more ancient stories, but there's no one standard version, for example, of the return of the heroes from Troy. There's
right.
like each tragedian, each comedian is going to write their own version of how it happened, and that was totally fine in the culture, and that was still considered religious in these festivals in Athens and other places where these plays were performed. Now, in the Jewish and Christian tradition, that I think the problem about trusting a book comes from the fact that we say this book we trust is part of the canon, and there's books that we cannot trust, so we exclude them. And I think that's why I think this question continues to be valid. It's about how do we determine what's canon and what isn't, and can we trust that if people 2,000 years ago decided that for us?
Well, so we have to just have a more sophisticated understanding of canon, right? So the problem again is when there's a lot of people for whom the Bible is, in my opinion, people worship the Bible, and so therefore they attribute all sorts of things to the Bible that are a misunderstanding of what it is. In our statement of Scripture, Community of Christ, Scripture is only revelatory when it's read and applied in the present. Read responsibly. So in other words, where it's like taken out of context in order to do harm to others or something like that, that's not responsible. When we realize the limitations of authors, there's so many ideas that haven't been invented, or people haven't realized. So when people are making statements that they think are true about biology, they don't know what it is. I mean, the kinds of things that are contemporarily true that that Aristotle and others will have said, we know that famously are not true now. And so the problem is that people would like to make the canon something that it's not. But this is why we are much more ready to bring texts that didn't make it in the canon and use those, because for what's more important is the insight, and what's more important is where we're at for our own, as we're attempting to, this is the hermeneutic part or whatever, where we're trying to apply things meaningfully in our lives today. We go reach well outside. We're very prepared to reach outside the canon, and we are also prepared to have dialogue with the people in the canon and actually say, when the Matthean community says that you still have to obey Old Testament law,
right.
We can say, no, we disagree with you. So
we still have a lot of questions, John,
we do?
But
Okay.
I have to be here like tomorrow in a couple of hours. So I'm going to jump to the last question in the queue, because I think it's going up here. This
we don't
one.
have to. Well, we can. Okay.
Yeah, we can close with that one. And then I promise that all the questions that you just sent in the chat that we haven't addressed, they're going to be there for
next time
for
we do
next
this. Okay.
time.
So Lithias asks, "Are you Mormon, John?" Which is a complicated identity question. So so Mormon is, generally speaking, for a long time has been an exonym. In other words, what people from outside the movement gave to people in the movement. What I could say is that I have ancestors who joined the Latter-day Saint movement back in the 1830s, and I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So lots of people, which is the Mormon Church, as it's colloquially known then. So lots of people just identify what Mormon means with being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I left, like I say, that church when I became an adult, and then I later actually resigned my membership in the church. So I'm not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is what a lot of people think of when they say, are you Mormon, and being part of the Mormon Church. Now that said, people sometimes think of a bigger group because they also then look at Mormon fundamentalists who are also not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These are people who hold to teachings of Brigham Young and John Taylor from the 19th century that includes especially famously the practice of, Joseph Smith also practiced polygamy. So what some of the early teachings of people in the movement who practiced polygamy. And so they're not members of the church. The modern LDS Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints condemns polygamy, but there's all kinds of Mormons who are not members of the church who do practice polygamy. I'm also not one of those. But so the community of Christ has a common origin with these churches. These other churches. We represent the part of the tradition that opposed Joseph Smith when he instituted polygamy. And so what I will say is that when we look back on this, we think of when Joseph Smith, for example, proposed to my great-great-great-great-grandparents that he would like to marry their 15-year-old daughter, and they said yes, and they married her to him, that I consider that to be an abuse of authority. That's something that should not have happened, and that in doing that, Joseph Smith abused his authority. But so we're within that tradition, the Community of Christ, which is the church that I'm now a member of and the pastor for a congregation in, doesn't use the term Mormon to refer to ourselves, and hasn't since the 1870s or so. Mm-hmm. and in fact, internally in this church, when we talk about the Mormons, we mean the Utah Church. So we mean the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so that isn't colloquially used. But what I will also say is that in some sense I consider myself to be ethnically Mormon. But Mormon as an ethnicity, I think, is declining and becoming diffuse as Mormons. I don't think it's as distinct as it once was when I was born. So that's my complicated answer to that question.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we're going to talk about the history
the Jerusalem Temple.
The Jerusalem Temple with John. If you haven't, please give us a like. Thank you for helping us get to 100 likes tonight. We will address the unanswered questions in our next Let There Be Answers session. And if you really enjoy these lectures and this content that we offer for free in this channel, if you have the capacity, please consider making a donation here in the chat or on our website, centerplace.ca.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.